And I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you to our panelists and all of the attendees who are joining us today, and thank you for being here. Our panel today is hosted by Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. Pollack Peacebuilding Systems is a conflict resolution consulting company focused on empowering organizations towards positive change through transformative peace processes. And you can learn more about our services and mission on our website, pollackpeacebuilding.com. So the focus of our panel today is navigating cross-cultural disputes at work. And Alyssa, Horace, and I will be your moderators today. And to be transparent about how we'll spend our time here, I'm going to quickly go over the layout of our panel. First, we will introduce our panelists so you can get to know a little bit about their background as well as where they're coming from. Next, we'll jump into questions regarding our topic, after which we're going to open the floor to a Q&A session. And if at any point during our panel, if any of our attendees think of a question to ask or something one of our panelists says interests you, feel free to type in your question into the question tab at the bottom, or you can utilize the chat box as well. Alyssa and I will moderate this chat box, and we'll do our best to address your questions during the Q&A session at the end. So we'll begin introducing our panelists now, and I'd like to start with Dr. Sukhsimranjit Singh. Dr. Sukhsimranjit Singh is the Judge Danny Weinstein Managing Director of the Strauss Institute of Dispute Resolution at Pepperdine University. He's an accomplished speaker, author, teacher, and practitioner in dispute resolution and has given talks in more than 40 countries. His current passion is cross-cultural dispute resolution, and he's giving TED Talks on the subject. And finding new ways to resolve traditional conflicts. I've had the privilege of being a student of Dr. Singh, and it has been one of my best experiences at Pepperdine, being able to be in his class and learn from him. He is there's a huge breadth of knowledge that he has on cross-cultural dispute resolution, and I'm so happy to have him here today. So thank you, Dr. Singh, for being here.
And I'll follow that up with an introduction to Toni Hawkins. Toni Hawkins has a background in psychology and health systems management and has put in more than 165 hours of conflict resolution training. Toni Hawkins focuses on her conflict resolution work on repairing and rebuilding relationships between people and also within institutions. She serves multiple segments of society as a coach, mediator, and trainer to support others in moving forward. From interpersonal disputes among family and friends to larger organizational challenges, Toni brings heart and opportunity to her clients through support and effective listening, empathy, and looking beyond the problem at hand and engaging with the hearts in the matter.
And then Professor Alan Weiner is the Senior Lecturer in Law and Director of the Program in International and Comparative Law at Stanford Law School and Director of the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation. His teaching and research focus on the fields of international security, where he focuses on contemporary security threats and the law of war, and interdisciplinary approaches to understanding international conflict resolution. Weiner practiced international law in the Legal Advisor's Office of the U.S. Department of State for more than a decade before joining the faculty at Stanford Law School. Thank you for being here, Professor Weiner.
And finally, we are introducing Jeremy Pollack, who is the founder of Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. Jeremy holds a master's degree in evolutionary anthropology from California State University, Fullerton, as well as a master's degree in negotiation, conflict resolution, and peacebuilding from California State University in Dominguez Hills. As a conflict resolution consultant, Jeremy has mediated conflicts between couples, co-executives, and organizations, aiming as often as possible to transform relationships and create win-win resolutions for all the parties involved. He also works as a personal development coach, helping individuals discover conflicts impeding them from living happy, fulfilling lives. Thank you all for joining us.
So to begin our questions here, I'm going to direct the first question to Jeremy, and then we can open it up for discussion with everyone. So Jeremy, can you tell us what is culture and how does it show up in the workplace? And additionally, how does it impact us?
Sure. So, well, there's been a lot of different conceptions of culture or definitions, by various researchers in multiple disciplines. But I think sort of a general definition would be a set of norms and values, beliefs that tend to distinguish a certain group of people from another. At least it creates within group similarities, and it's sort of a distinguishing line between one group than another. And of course, every culture, especially, or most cultures, especially large cultures, have multiple subcultures. Every group has multiple subgroups. Organizations are, of course, its own sort of subgroup of a society, and so it is essentially a subculture of a larger culture. And I guess the question was, how does it impact organizations? How does culture? So the only thing I would say is, when we have subcultures or subgroups, it's intuitive, and I think plenty of sort of research goes to show that the subcultures, subgroups are by default influenced by the larger culture and the larger group. So in some sense, an organization being a subgroup of a larger society is going to be influenced by some of the cultural distinguishing lines within that society. So whatever is going on in the society is probably going to trickle down into the organization on some level. Now, the interesting part about organizations is, once you join an organization, you also create your own subculture. In other words, you also create some shared identity with the people that you're in the organization with, so that now you have dual identity. So someone who you might have seen out on the street, and you say, oh, that's someone who's not part of my group, that's part of another group, or cultural or social category. Now all of a sudden, you can say, oh, that person's actually part of my group. And so now you have these sort of shared identities, but also distinguishing identities. And that's the interesting part about organizations. And it has advantages and disadvantages for people in organizations, leading to some of these cross-cultural disputes that we're going to talk about. Anyway, that's how I might define culture and how it impacts organizations. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
Well, I was just actually even thinking that even within the organizations, oftentimes different departments or different teams that have different functions, they have their own subcultures within the organization. Like, for example, there's the stereotype of, your IT people behaving a certain way that is very different, and communicating in a way that's very different from, say, your marketing people or people in those more creative types of teams. So, there's almost no limit to the way we can break down cultures and subcultures and that sort of thing.
I think that's a major topic of conversation in organizations, is how much to focus on the larger culture of the entire organization versus how much to focus on the culture of particular teams in the organization, and how appropriate is it for all the teams to have a shared culture, or to what extent should that culture be shared versus just having your own subcultures within teams. And I think that kind of depends on the organization. And Alan, were you going to say something?
Let me hold it until we get into our. The one thing I would note that I think is really relevant in this regard is what we know from the social psychological research about what it means to have a culture and what it means to have a group identity. And it is often the case that we form a group identity, not so much on the basis of things that we identify that we have in common, but in juxtaposition to other groups or people who we see as others, right? And that can be, a very troubling feature in an organization if what it means to have a strong sense of belonging to a particular group or subgroup within an organization is to say, we're not them, we're different from them, right? And that that's a phenomenon that often lends itself to the emergence of intergroup conflict, right? So that's one of the group identities. We see this with race, ethnicity, various other kinds of subgroup identities. The very process of constituting or forming an identity can involve an othering of other groups. And that is a recipe or a formula, potentially, not necessarily, but it's potentially a formula for then group conflict.
I can comment too. Can you hear me? Is that good?
Yeah.
So I love those. Thank you all. I think to add on to the discussion, culture is omnipresent. Every one of us have it. And it's the presence is so strong, we don't realize that we have it till we are deprived of it. When you travel to new cultures around the world, unfortunately right now most of us can't, but when you travel, you will realize there are standards that are different in different cultures. Because of those standards, what our minds creates are expectations. We expect certain things to happen this way or that way. When the expectations are not met, we call them weird, we call different, we call them us versus them. At the end of this, culture, I think, is about communication, is somehow learning to communicate because of that very differences than because of what is common. So I love how Professor Weiner mentioned about us versus them versus seeing the commonalities. And there is one way you can define culture as a group of people based on some thinking over a period of time that has value systems in it. And there is another definition of culture, I think by Kluckholm, which says culture is what separates people from one group to another. So it's very interesting. You can define culture in different ways and come to a different mindset about culture. But one thing is for clear, it is present in every organization. It can be something that can be changed. It may take time, and it is something to be aware of. And I'm a law professor. I can go on for 3 hours, but I think I should stop.
Yeah, I mean, one thing if coming from the evolutionary perspective, from theorists that have looked at culture from evolutionary psychology, like David Buss and Joe Heinrich and John Tooby, they talk a lot about culture being the expression of evolved psychological mechanisms, and really looking at culture as not some sort of entity, as some thing that happens, but really the product of a bunch of psychologies operating together in some way. And then and a lot of those psychologies have built into them these fundamental psychological phenomenon called biases. And one of those biases are biases for, preferences for an in-group versus an out-group. And then that leads to people in different groups expressing themselves in certain ways that are basically signals of in-group commitment or in-group membership. And so all these signals happen, and then, so it's all these interesting phenomena are happening in a larger context that are basically, on some level, thought of as adaptive psychologies, are of course operating at all our levels of culture, including our organizations. So I think, looking at it from that lens of like culture as a sort of entity, as a thing, right, as a collective action, and then also as this product of individual psychologies.
I think you raise a very good point, which is, do we create culture or are we slaves to culture? Mm. Do we have a choice to belong to a culture, or can we get out of a culture? Those are very interesting points with your evolved psychological association point.
Yeah. It is. Well, it's like, do we have the ability to transcend our own biases? Because in-group, out-group biases is one of many biases, many mental heuristics that the mind sort of operates on, and do we have the ability to transcend it? I don't know. I mean, certainly research has shown that even despite our biases, there's ways of lowering prejudice, lowering out-group anxiety, increasing feelings of similarity, feelings of enjoying being around the company of people from quote unquote out groups and that kind of thing. So I don't know that it's possible to get past our biases, but certainly we can like each other despite of them, essentially. I mean, at least that's what it seems. That's what contact theory seems to say.
This is a really nice segue into our next question, which is directed towards Dr. Singh. What can we do to constructively handle cross-cultural differences and cross-cultural disputes in the workplace?
Short answer is a lot. Long answer is it's delicate, it's difficult, it's nuanced, it's based from context to context, corporation to corporation, place to place. What you could do in India, you cannot do in the US in some instances. I remember Alyssa giving a talk in Punjab, where I grew up. After 20 years of living abroad, I went back and I gave a talk with the judges of High Court, which is Supreme Court of the state of Punjab and Haryana. And I remember walking away from a podium where I was supposed to stand. While my talk was well received, I asked a judge afterwards, what is one or two things I should change, or something I ask people to improve further, right? And he very politely mentioned, he said, young man, everything was great. You used a lot of I in your opening. Instead of I used you and they and yourselves. And second, you walked away, which was great, dynamic, wonderful. But here in our local culture, as you understand, stay behind the podium. So, you know, so it, so what is culture is unique. How do we change is unique. So I have a couple of tips to begin with, but let me go deeper into the question. The first two tips I have is flexibility. You need to know how to improvise based on different employees and people in your corporation, in your organization, in your workplace. It is not them who should change to you. It is you. If you are a good leader, you need to know how to connect with people differently. You need to know that people are at different places. You need to know that different people are at different places given the day, the time. It may not be culture. It may be personality, it may be gender. It may not be gender and personality. It may be the mood that they are in that day. It may be what happened in the morning in their home or what happened last night. You have to be the one who can improvise is my first tip. Number two tip I have is communication is the most powerful way of developing relationships. It is the most powerful way of reaching impasse. And it is one of the easiest ways in which we as human beings create misunderstandings. It is through break in communication, through underestimating the power of good communication, and through the use of under communication. We don't talk enough. We see somebody coming in late and we send an email. Hey, you are late today. Instead of walking over to that room and saying, everything okay? You see, it's the same communication done differently. And the entire day of that person is going to change based on, did you send an email or did you walk over? Right? Before a big event is announced for the corporation, let's say with 20 people, let's say non-government organization, NGO, and the email went out to the world, hey, our NGO is planning to do 3 things in Brazil, in China, and India. Well, does every person in your NGO knows that's going to happen? That's communication. It's not the intent of the person who's sending the email, could be the leader or could be somebody else, that was wrong. Intent could be perfect. The question, as usually we talk about, is impact of that action that took place. So those are 2 thoughts on which my answer is based, but let me give you a little deeper understanding. Let's understand a couple of things. Number 1, I said culture is omnipresent. This time I'm going to say culture is powerful. Understanding culture is not easy. It is complex. I've been having a rendezvous with culture for 17 years of my life in terms of academics and practice. But most of my life, I've lived in different cultures. I'm at least a bicultural, not multicultural person myself. And what my understanding, my empathy, what my growth, my upbringing in a totally different culture than where I'm right now. I'm living in California right now, within the culture of Pepperdine University. Very proud to belong to the Church of Christ community on campus, where I am the only that I know of, only Sikh living on campus. Imagine the culture, right? Where I grew up was totally different. I grew up in a majority Sikh culture where everybody else wore turbans. But I feel the same because I guess one connection we have is the religion. We grew up in a religious society. I live in a religious society. So it's fascinating. But look, India overall is so complex. I think Jeremy earlier mentioned it beautifully, that culture has subcultures. We cannot ignore regional cultures. So just a quick example. India has 28 states, 200 plus languages and dialects, 16 different ways of making a cuisine, 12 different styles of wearing a turban. When you say Indian culture, which one are you speaking about? So culture is powerful in that sense. That's the word I want to use. It's powerful. Spend some time understanding it. Don't read one article or read a book and think we become expert. Talk to people. People are the best representations of culture. You want to understand Brazilian culture? Go to Brazil. Spend time as per the local standards. Make a Brazilian friend. Ask him or her what culture is. Learn Portuguese. Understand how the language impacts the psyche, the heart, the art of people. It's an investment. It's a lifetime investment for some of us. I'm still learning about America. One thing that fascinates me is work culture. I'm still learning 16 years in how beautiful, how interesting, how delicate, how nuanced This whole point of work ethic in America is, when do we say no and when do we say yes? I'm still learning, because where I grew up, you always said yes. And it was very hard for me to take a no because I always said yes. So let me conclude. One more point I want to add to how culture impacts work culture. You see, when you have miscommunication, my earlier point, remember I talked about flexibility and communication. When you have miscommunication, something new happens. Conflict or stress takes birth. When you have conflict, we need to understand a couple of things. Conflict takes our energy away. Conflict brings mistrust. Conflict creates boundaries. Conflict can be unpredictable, and conflict create emotions. In all of those categories, emotion, unpredictability, boundaries, mistrust, and less energy, we tend to go into us and them. We tend to go into miscommunication mode. We tend to go into blaming than understanding. So the best tip I have is understanding these delicacies of conflict and culture together will bring you, I hope it brings us to this beyond my community, beyond my tribe, beyond my identity framework. I think Jeremy mentioned earlier, we need to look beyond who we are. We need to be really open to red and blue, to white and brown, to Asian and American. We need to open those minds up, because the more boundaries, that's so easy to create. Color, age, politics, gender, religion, my town, my accent, my preference, my is so easy. It's difficult to include us. I will stop here. I have a lot more to add, but I'm mindful of everyone else's time. Thank you for this opportunity. Lovely to be with all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I can. There are so many great points in there, and I had so many thoughts while you were talking. But I love that the last point that you make about sharing cultures and sort of transcending, getting past this idea of us and them. And I think when we talk about these ideas of cultures and subcultures, if we take an expansive view of culture, I mean, at the very far end, the very largest end of culture, we're all part of a culture called humanity, and maybe even further than that, we're all part of a culture called earthbound creatures, sharing with all kinds of animals and plants and stuff like that. So like what, and then if you drill down to the very sort of acute sense of culture, you could look at the family, or you could even look at an individual. Like, what is an individual's culture for oneself? And I don't know that you would call that culture necessarily, but one's own norms, one's own individuality. So you have this humanity and individuality at both ends. And I often question, like, why are we so focused a lot of times on the differences in these particular social categories? Like in America, or in Los Angeles, or in a particular area of Los Angeles, we have a certain social category that's salient. We call it, this color versus that color, or this gender versus that gender. But then if you go to certain parts of India, you have a certain social category that's salient, this caste versus this caste, or something like that. So why are we so focused on these particular salient social categories and not focused on the ones that we share, which is our humanity, and also the ones that we are so unique in, which is our individuality? And how do we move between them? That was just a thought when you were talking.
I love that thought, and Jeremy, I want to add two thoughts quickly. One is memory plays a big role. If all of our memories are wiped out, we have no culture. It exists in our mind, these expectations, these social norms, and the power those norms belong to, the traditions of a family, of a culture, of a religion. They're all in our mind. So in many ways, it's interesting to investigate, relearn, very difficult to relearn, be curious, be open, be empathetic. It's difficult. So the question was, how can we constructively handle cross-cultural differences? I would say people, invest in people, learn, put your time, presence, attention to them, read, become curious, understand, expand your worldview. And third, celebrate the differences instead of being fearful of those differences. Yeah.
Yeah, I might just add also helping people focus on their shared identities, as well as honoring each other's unique identities simultaneously could be powerful. I mean, sometimes when we talk, we do some, conflict resolution in organizations. People have forgotten that they're on the same team. They start seeing each other as enemies, or as me versus him, or us versus them. They have little factions, and they've forgotten that, hey, we're all part of the same team here, and that can be extended out into society. We're all part of the same team here. We're all on Team Human, and or we're in an organization. We're all on the same team here. They forget that, and so anything that we can do to help, sort of, to be cliche, team building exercises, but really to help build the sense of we are all aligned here. We're all on the same team, essentially. That can be very helpful, and that can differ depending on what culture you're in or what organization.
I think that's also a good segue to our next question. We'll direct to Professor Weiner. So what role does organizational culture play in cross-cultural dispute resolution?
Well, thanks, Noah, for the question, and thanks to all for giving me a chance to participate in the event. And that's what we always say at these things. Thanks for giving me a chance to participate. But in this case, it actually has the virtue of being true for me. I'm actually kind of the skunk at the garden party on this panel with respect to culture, because most of my work has been focused on essentially international, interstate conflict, or intractable political conflicts between groups like Israelis and Palestinians. And, I have kind of come at this with the perspective of political science and the perspective of lawyers, international lawyers, and you basically see groups as groups. And I've tended to, number one, I started out by discounting to a certain extent the role of culture. I thought, when two groups are in an armed conflict, when they're fighting over control of territory or dignity, there's so many more similarities than differences. And of course, I've moved beyond that to realize, okay, I don't want to discount the role of culture. What I just have to recognize is that I don't know enough about culture to talk very much about what role it plays. I'm understanding increasingly that it is important, but I don't want to hold myself out as an expert, because again, I have tended to look at these things from a little bit more of a structural standpoint. So let me tell you some things that I do maybe know from the work that I've done that are maybe a little bit helpful, and some of them are structural. So when we're talking about conflict, when we're talking about intergroup conflict, one of the things that is also very important are the dynamics within each group that might help us understand conflict. And so one of the classic problems is the principal agent problem, right? So you might have a negotiation within a group between workers and management, right? And it might be, to take an example, you might be thinking about a situation in which we want to change healthcare policy, right? And workers and management might have very different views on that. It could be that the leaders of the union, for instance, are people who are older and have higher health needs, right? And they might be holding out for a more expansive healthcare benefits package, which would actually not be helpful to the rank and file, who would otherwise be able to get other benefits that they would value more, right? So this principal agent problem, recognizing people who are speaking on behalf of a group might have their own interests that might not necessarily be the same thing that's best for the group. And we see this, of course, in my international, interstate conflicts all the time, right? Donald Trump wants to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan. Is that because that's what's best for the United States, or what's best for Afghanistan? Or is that because it's what Donald Trump thinks is good for his own personal self-interest? Another phenomenon that comes out of the work that I do, and I'm going to apply to the workplace a little bit, is just the tendency to demonize the other group in conflict situations, right? To immediately move to the feeling that, like, not only do we disagree, but the other side is unreasonable, right? In some of the work I've done, I've described this as enemy aversion. Sometimes we think the other side is so unreasonable that we're not even willing to sit down with them, right? In my context, when we identify other groups as terrorist organizations, right? At that point, of course, they're not people who we can even speak with, right? Where we can't even negotiate with them. Now, and then sometimes we start to internalize our beliefs about the other side. And let me take this to the workplace. One of the things that I do in my free time, in addition to serving on the faculty at Stanford Law School, is that I'm an elected public school board official here in California. And right now we're really struggling with the problem of trying to get our schools reopened, right? And to try to get students and teachers back on campus. And I think the way that we began this process, it might not be unreasonable to describe the way the teachers thought about what management was doing. I think the teachers began to see management as really unreasonable and believing that management wanted to return teachers to the campus, right, in a way that would put teachers at risk, that the management was unwilling to be solicitous of their concerns about safety. And as a result, they said, we won't go back to campus until there is a vaccine and there are no cases of COVID-19 in the county for 14 days. In other words, until the disease has been eradicated. Now, that's probably not a position that ultimately is viable, but because of the belief that management was so unreasonable, I think the teachers actually began to internalize this position, which may have started out as a negotiating point, right? But then you start to deliver that message to your own constituency. We won't go back until there's a vaccine. It then becomes very difficult to move off that position, right? You've created expectations within your own group about what your minimum demands are. You did that maybe to posture or maybe to negotiate or maybe to signal your skepticism towards the feelings or good faith of the other side. And it becomes very difficult to climb down. This is the phenomenon of audience costs, right? You're kind of taking a strong stance towards the other group, but of course, your own side is listening and saying, like, yeah, we won't go back until there's a vaccine. And then you're a little trapped. Those are some structural phenomena. Let me just talk very briefly also just about some social psychological phenomena that apply, I think, in these contexts. And we already heard Jeremy and others talk about, and we've talked a lot about, the self versus other, the intergroup dynamics, but I think it's worth really understanding both for individual conflict and for intergroup conflict, this phenomenon of narratives and perceptions and the way that we perceive conflict. And there's a very powerful idea that came from one of my colleagues here at Stanford, Lee Ross, called naive realism. And essentially, naive realism, it's an incredibly simple concept. It's axiomatic, in fact. And when I would go and do talks and I would say, like, this is what we research, people would say, like, seriously, that's what you research? Like my third grader could have figured that out. But until you start thinking about it, and here's the idea. The idea is that we each believe that we see the world as it really is. We each believe that we see the world as it really is. We each believe that our beliefs about things are reasonable, because if our beliefs weren't reasonable, we would change them and they would become reasonable. Now, in conflict settings, that becomes very difficult because the other side has views that are quite different from yours. So what do we think? The first thing that we think is like, well, they just don't understand. They don't know what I know. They don't have the benefit of my perspectives. So, I often ask my students in my conflict resolution class, if two people are having disagreement, what would you suggest that they do? And invariably somebody says, like, well, they should sit down and they should talk about it. They should talk about it. They should talk it through. It sounds kind of sensible, right? But then I ask them, everybody goes into these dialogues thinking, if I just spend 20 minutes with my adversary and explain to them why I see the world as I do and why I have the reasonable belief that I do, if I just had 20 minutes to explain it to them, they would come around to my way of thinking because my view is reasonable, right? Nobody goes into these dialogues thinking, if I just spent 20 minutes with the other side, they would explain to me why my views are wrong and why I should change my opinion. So then when you go into these dialogues and the other side doesn't change their mind, now you've got a big problem, I used to think the problem was that they didn't have all the facts, they didn't have all the information, but now I've explained it to them. Now I realize the problem is with them, right? And then we start to make what's known as the fundamental attribution error. There's something wrong with them. They're selfish, they're evil, they're unreasonable, and now conflict resolution becomes much more difficult. So how do we address that? I think the best way to do that, some of the work that we've done in our group, a couple of things that we've tried. Number one is to, as Jeremy mentioned, we try to basically, first of all, not get people to talk about how they want this conflict to end, why they believe what they believe, but to simply just get them to talk about what they want. What do you want? What do you want for yourselves? What do you want for your community, right? What's important to you? And I think when one side begins to hear what the other side wants, it's like, oh, they want decent education for their kids. They want to feel safe in their homes, right? They want dignity at the workplace. They want to feel safe. They want a living wage. Everybody thinks like, well, that's actually not that crazy. That's kind of what I want too, right? So it begins to provide a basis for some understanding. Another technique that we use to kind of try to deal with these cultural and intergroup conflicts is we try to get each side at some point to say, tell the other side's narrative, right? Just restate it. And you have to restate the other side's narrative about this conflict or disagreement. Not that you agree with it, but when the other side hears it, they said, yes, that is an accurate rendition of my view. It's incredibly difficult to do, right? But I think when parties do that, it can be very helpful in terms of helping them to see the other side's, what's reasonable about the other side's narrative. And the ultimate question that we get to, and maybe this goes to the whole question of culture, is we ask the parties to start to say, can you envision in the conflict resolution world, an intractable political conflict where people are killing each other? We try to get people to say, can you envision a mutually bearable future? It doesn't have to be a mutually bearable shared future. It doesn't have to be a shared vision. You don't have to agree, but can each of you articulate a vision when the other side says like, yeah, that'd be okay for me. I could live with that. And that's a harder thing to do than you would think, because normally what we focus on in conflict processes is talking about what I need. Let me tell you what I need. Let me tell you what's important to me. In my teacher management scenario, it's easy for me as management to say, like, teachers, this is what I need. I need to have kids back on campus. I can also hear the teachers saying like, hey, management, you need to understand what I need. I need to feel safe at work, right? Can we begin to talk about a story where they say, I need to feel safe at work in a way that meets your needs of bringing kids back to campus? And can I, as management, say, I need to bring kids back to campus, but I need to do it in a way that it's tolerable, it's bearable for you? And those are some of the processes and dynamics that we use. I'll stop there.
That was great. Can I just recap real fast some of the points that we've all talked about, just because I think they'd be useful in terms of some techniques. One thing that Dr. Singh mentioned was just basically communication, how to get people to start communicating more frequently and more positively, that sort of thing. I would also wanted to add, I read an interesting paper about communication, and they were specifically about conflict resolution, and they were talking about that communication doesn't have to be just dialogue. There's other ways of communicating with each other, through music or through, shared experiences, through sports, like different things like that. So having people communicate, and Alan, you mentioned what I would call a value alignment. So getting to underlying interests, underlying values. What is it that you really want? What is it that you really want? And then getting to those underlying values and aligning those, like, whoa, I understand you want your family to be safe. I get that. That makes sense. I want my family to be safe too. Now we're in agreement on some level. We both want our families to be safe. Does that sound right? That value, that sort of underlying interest, underlying value alignment there?
Exactly. And it may be that if we're in a war zone, it will be hard for each of our families to be safe. But what we begin to realize is that the other person, is not somebody worthy of demonization, right? That they actually are people who, want the same things as we do. And maybe they are the kind of people who we could begin to explore log rolling and trade-offs rather than just thinking like, I can't deal with those people.
Yeah, like recognizing someone being a human being rather than an enemy. It actually that can result from seeing, oh, this person actually has very similar needs to me. They have the same basic psychological needs that I do, you know, or fewer physical needs. The other one we talked about was basically the steelman argument, which is like present the other person's argument, present the other side's narrative as, you know, as if you were arguing, not arguing for them, but that they would agree with, that they would hear back and go, yes, that's what I believe, that's what I want. So that would be one. And then also the idea of an imagined future. That's an important concept in conflict transformation is, what does the imagined future look like if things go well here, if we can transform this conflict in some way? And then the other thing that I wanted to reflect on was the idea of shared identity. What can we do in some way to help people remember that they have a shared identity, whether that's a shared identity because we're on the same team or same organization, or just generally same nation, same humanity, something like that. So those are just some of the concepts I wanted to recap on. Thank you for indulging me in that.
I guess one thing that I keep thinking about is, in a lot of organizations, regardless of the size, you have your leadership or your management, and then you have kind of everyone else. And so I think particularly here in America, we are doing better at making the everyone else more diverse. So we're increasing diversity among, you know, the teams, but diversity and among leadership is going at a much slower rate. And so then you don't have that role model for your teams with regards to communicating and with regards to cultural acceptance and that sort of thing. So your teams might very well be diverse, but they don't get to see their managers having to do the same things that they're being asked to do. So they don't, you know, we don't have that role model among leadership. Okay, we're working together, we're overcoming these cultural things and you know, with regards to gender, all the different ways that we, you know, group ourselves. But because we don't have the diversity among leadership, you know, they're not able to exhibit and to show and to teach the teams how to deal with cross-cultural conflicts, or even just, I think, even communicate.
That's a great transition into the final question for you, Toni, which are, what are the practical takeaways we can use to effectively deal with cross-cultural disputes in our workplace and or personal lives?
Thank you. So this has been wonderful. I'm learning so much. And I will say that for me, the key word in this is practical. It's the word that kept coming out for me, the practical part. And so I made a list. I have a few items. And the first one is to start with the person closest to you. And that person that you have the greatest effect on, that you can have the greatest influence over, and that person is actually yourself. Start with yourself. Examine your own biases. Ask yourself about your values. What do you believe in? What prejudices do you have? How do you behave? And not only how do you think you behave, how do you think others perceive you? So start thinking about those things. And then what are your hot buttons? What are your triggers? What are the things that aggravate you? What are the ways that you can grow and do better? So I feel like greater self-awareness, greater mindfulness of your own culture, your own belief systems, your own values, your own actions, your own behaviors, even your own speech, how your tone, the way you say things, how that might be affecting other people. All of those things will help you with regards to communicating with others, and then addressing and being more open to people from other cultures. The second thing on my list is to check your own assumptions. And so since we're talking about cross-cultural conflict management, we don't want to make the assumption that because there's a conflict, and that conflict might be between people of different cultures, that the conflict itself is a result of the cultures. It could be a task process-based conflict. It could be a processes conflict, you know, different views about how something should be done, or different views or ideas about what should be done. So we don't want to make assumptions that just because, you know, there's a woman over here arguing with a man, that's, you know, the basis for why there's a conflict. And then we don't want to assume that the little bit we think we know, and I say think like with a lot of emphasis, the little bit that we think we know about someone or their culture or about who they are, we don't want to assume that it's applicable to that person, that situation, or even that culture. Just because you can look at me and say, okay, that's an African-American woman, she does this, that, and that. Maybe, maybe not. Don't assume. And so from there, I go to my third point, which is to learn about the people around you. And there's so many ways to do it now. I mean, when I was young, I had to go to the library and go to the card catalog, which, Alyssa, you probably don't know what that is. But literally, you have to look things up in a little box and go find books off the shelves, and then you have to open all the books on the table. Now, you can Google. You have endless numbers of documentaries and videos and movies and books and all kinds of ways that you can learn about all kinds of people. And then you can ask questions and ask from a place of sincere curiosity. Make people feel, I'm really interested. I really want to learn. I really want to know this about you. But then you also have to give them the space, because if everyone doesn't always feel like teaching. So ask with the openness that you really want to learn, but then also be accepting of the fact that, they may not really want to share it right at that point, but then maybe they'll come back later and you all can have experience together or spend some time together and you can still learn. But that's another thing I think is very important. And then, Dr. Singh and Mr. Weiner have already spoken about this, and you too, Jeremy, is to listen. I think it's probably the most important aspect of communication. And listen with the intention of learning and not with the goal of sharing your ideas or of teaching them. Listen with the intention of learning from them. And I just, you're going to get from that in the long run. Also, my fifth thing is to highlight the presence and the contributions of various cultures. So, it's a good thing for people to be different. We're all made different for a reason. And it's because when we bring our best selves to anything, it's going to be better. Look at it like a party. Like before COVID, we used to have, house parties all the time. And I think I'm a pretty good cook. However, when I tell everyone, bring your best dish, bring the part or the thing that you want to share with everyone else. When everyone brings their best to the table, it makes the party so much better. And I think the same thing is true in any workplace, in any educational setting. A choir, a band, everyone's playing something different. If everyone brings their best, the product is going to be so much better. And then also, most of us are taught the golden rule growing up: do unto others as you have them do unto you. So Dr. Toni Alessandro, he came up with the platinum rule, which I think is even so much better. It's do unto others as they want to be treated. That requires you to ask. That requires you to care. That requires you to want to build relationship to the point where you can ask, what is it that you want from me? What can I do? How can I do this better? How can I communicate with you? Help me to help us by you telling me, you sharing with me what it is I can do to make things better. And then I think one of the most important things is, like I said, we all have different talents, different gifts. So with regards to conflict in the workplace, whether it be cross-cultural or not, hire an expert, hire a conflict management professional to come in and help with this, because not only can they help with the presenting conflict, but they can help to teach and to train those parties how to communicate better in the future, and the organization as well. So those are sort of my practical tips with regards to how to deal with conflict, cross-cultural conflict management in a workplace.
Nice. Thanks, Toni. By the way, I love that analogy. I love the analogy of the potluck, or even of the band, which, like, you don't want the band is not 15 guitarists all playing together. I mean, I've never seen that before anyway, but like having all these different instruments, or a potluck with all these different types of foods, that's what really makes a great potluck type thing. Yeah. So there's so much value to diversity.
Yeah. I've been at a potluck where everybody brought chicken. I mean, there was, 5 different fried chickens, there was baked chicken, there was barbecue chicken, there was chicken salad. Okay, so chicken is great, but here's the other stuff.
Yeah.
For the sake of time, we're going to transition into some questions. We have one from Henry. He says, interest-based negotiation has been the standard in negotiation practice, yet it seems to be an incomplete approach. A more holistic approach seems to be movement from positions to interests, and then beyond to emotions, values, and finally to needs. Do any of the panelists have a comment on this?
I don't know, Alan, you want to go on that one?
Well, let me start. I mean, it's a great question. Henry. And in fact, the center that I run at Stanford, the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation, the original founders include Robert Wilson, who just won the Nobel Prize, Ken Arrow, who has won a Nobel Prize, Amos Tversky, who was the partner of Dan Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize. I feel like I'm like the kind of ugly stepchild somehow, and like now running this program that was run by all of these great luminaries. But that's where that center began, right? With the problem, Fisher and Urey getting to yes was the big, approach to conflict resolution. How do you basically expand the pie? How do you use interest-based negotiations to resolve conflict? And what we found, there are many, many conflicts in which getting to yes doesn't lead to yes. And what we were interested in was what we call the barriers analysis, very simply, what stands in the way. We think that there are situations, there are conflicts where we could imagine outcomes that would actually be in the interest of both parties, not just one party, but both sides, right? A Pareto improving outcome. And yet the parties can't realize that resolution. And we were trying to figure out what stands in the way. So we look a lot at social psychological phenomena of construal perception, both of the other side, behavioral economic perceptions of feelings of gains and loss. When I'm engaged in a trade, I'm giving you something, you're giving me something. It turns out I overvalue what I'm giving up, I undervalue what I'm getting, just because of the dynamics of psychological perception. This is what we learned from behavioral economics. I look at organizational structures. We talked about some of these a little bit today, principal agent problems, powerful interest groups within an organization who might serve as spoilers to prevent. And increasingly, there's also work, I think, Henry, on some of what you're talking about, which is just the power of sentiments and emotions. And so these are all, I think, really important variables to add to understanding what's necessary to solve intergroup conflict. Yeah.
I'm happy to add a couple of thoughts. That's your second good question here. I think we're looking for a third one after this. I think there's a good amount of work done by our friends at Harvard School producing the Getting to Yes book and other books, Getting Past No, Getting Beyond Why. And the one I like the most is Beyond Winning. I may have it right here. So if you haven't seen this one, you may want to pick it up. And the reason is, again, I'm not the author. My colleague from Harvard Law School, Bob Mnookin, is. And let me tell you why.
One of the other co-founders, by the way, of my center.
Well, let me bring up why I bring up the idea behind this book, or what we do at the Strauss Institute when we teach 6 days of mediated and litigated case, one of our famous trainings in mediation. We do teach a day of distributive bargaining and a day of integrative bargaining. We don't just go beyond the surface and look at the interest unless we focus on game theory as well. And if you look at game theory, this idea of our lure for competition versus cooperation, and this constant dilemma in our minds, which one should I be? Should I be assertive or should I be empathetic? Should I be nice or should I stand up on my backbone and fight? What this dance, right? And it's an international question. It's a cross-cultural, across the globe question. What should I do? And if you look at the most famous negotiations around the world, and my colleague Michel Lebron published a book on that as well, and my own work on it. My essay with Lila Love out of Cardozo on generosity and looking at different spiritual traditions to see what commonalities we have to teach to dispute resolution. What we are looking at is this: that let's not get married to interest-based negotiation or position-based bar negotiation, so forth and so on, or the idea that emotions are somehow separate, needs are separate, and all the work that has been done is not enough or incomplete or bad. What we have to see it is, why do we love to do this dance? And I have one quick answer, right? And that's one reason why yesterday, and Chuck Crumpton is here from Hawaii, an amazing mediator, very experienced thinker, writer, teacher. And I don't know what he's doing here. He knows it all. But thank you, Chuck, for being here. And yesterday, Chuck and I were present to honor Judge Danny Weinstein. And we had more than 100 people, 130 people at one point join us, because we just introduced Beyond the Dialogue initiative from the Strauss Institute, thanks to a grant by Judge Danny Weinstein, $1 million grant, and among other supporters of us. And what we're looking at is, how do we go beyond the dialogue? What we need to do to remove or reduce or work with the polarization in this country. But I want to make one point. If you listen to President Obama, who recently spoke 3 days ago or 4 days ago on 60 Minutes, he made a good point. He said, don't think this polarization is new, that suddenly America has come to this big divide. It has been in the making. It has always been the case. Now it's come to the surface. I think there's a very deep point there. The question is, it's not something new and came up and now we resolve it. The question is, it has always existed in human psyche. And what are we doing in the field that is helping move that, resolve it? And what are we not doing that we further need to look into to explore it deeper? So I agree with you. In short answer is, I agree with you. When you look at emotions, we look into distributive bargaining, game theory, competitiveness, cooperativeness, whatever works with different people and cultures and personalities. At the same time, we need to leave a message of hope for the next generation. Many of us in this call right now, except I guess Alyssa and Noah, and many of us will be, who knows, but we won't be as meaningful in 30, 40, 50 years, but you will be, right? What is it that we are leaving the message for, that you take our field to the next level, because we need it. We need to create that next theory, that next practice that understands where we are at. And hopefully we won't reach back at this place where discrimination, where racism, where hatred is not only present, it is celebrated. And that is just a dire situation we are in. So before I get too emotional, I'll stop here.
Dr. Singh, one of the things that I think is that, I mean, there's safety being a part of the group. And so people will find ways to find their group, and they feel safe in that. But what we want people to do is to go beyond that and to look outside of your group and look and find all the ways that we're similar. But that requires courage and that willingness to let go of the safety of being
Beautiful.
that part of the group.
Love
so
Judge Danny talks about creating safe spaces, and to create safe spaces, you have to get out of your own safety. Absolutely, be vulnerable, be open to emotions, and no, absolutely, that is true, and that's how we bring change. And we need to bring change. I mean, if we are content with where we are at, we should not be. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we can all see that, right? We can feel it, we can see it. I mean, to see beyond that colors of the skins, and so anyway, so I'm let me be a little untraditional here. I have not heard much from Noah or Alyssa, and I'm really interested to at least hear a word from you two. You know, you're beautiful, both of you. Come on, say something, because you are our leaders.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank
That
you.
just made my day. I can let Noah go first if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Singh. Yeah, I find this whole discussion on how do it's all related, it's all interconnected, right? We have cross-cultural dispute resolution trying to reach across the table with people who are different from us and who look different from us, who practice different things from us, and and we see that connected to our polarization in the United States and in the world, and the key is like how do we bridge the gap, how do we reach across the table when people aren't necessarily open to doing so. And I think that I think that we've from this panel discussion, we've had a lot of great tips on how to maybe make that first step. And I must applaud for all of you here, our panelist guests who are experts in conflict resolution, for helping pave the way up into this moment to where we have today, so that when Alyssa and our generation comes to in 30, 40 years, that we're able to continue that, we'll pass the baton forward and continue hopefully making change in a positive direction. So I really appreciate that, and thank you, Dr. Singh.
I agree with Noah. I think this has a lot of really great applications for what we're seeing in the political and social atmosphere that's going on right now. And particularly what was said earlier about kind of this unwillingness to really listen to another person's perspective and going into the conversation thinking that you're going to convince somebody else, like that mindset of, oh, if I just speak to them, they'll understand. You're not really trying to explain, you're trying to persuade. And I definitely think when you walk in a room trying to persuade somebody, you immediately kind of lost the battle in a sense, because that's not really resolving anything when you're just trying to persuade somebody. And I definitely see a lot of those applications on social media, on Twitter, Facebook. My mom is always sending me stuff. So I definitely think, and Noah and I have had our own private conversations about stuff like this before, so we could go on. But I definitely see a lot of applications for what we've been talking about today. And yeah, I hope we're able to continue this productive conversation for decades and generations to come. And to an earlier point about what President Obama said, this divide and this atmosphere has been here for ages. I think a lot of people are being made aware of it now, but for a lot of us, we were aware of it growing up through comments or things like that. So I definitely think now's a really good time to, now that everyone's kind of aware, let's move forward and try and create positive change.
You both make me smile, and everybody else is smiling because we see hope here. Okay, we're gonna leave on good terms.
Generation of peace builders.
And open-mindedness and creativity and energy, and there it is, So, Jeremy, thank you for inviting us. I personally am very thank you, and a pleasure to be with you, Toni and Alan.
Yeah, I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much, Dr. Singh and Alan and Toni and Alyssa and Noah. For moderating this. If I could just leave it with, if I know we're about to close, but if I could just leave with a certain point, I think from what we were just discussing, and especially even on an emotional level, if we hope to move beyond these boundaries, I think that we need to fundamentally start to have a different relationship with the idea of discomfort. And if I start, because if I'm feeling uncomfortable or uncomfortable with a particular conversation or a particular group, and then I let that emotion of discomfort result in me avoiding the situation or even aggressing in the situation, it really perpetuates it. And if I can start to learn, hey, being in some discomfort is okay, it may actually be the right way to go, so that I start challenging my own beliefs, I start questioning myself, I start putting myself in situations with people that I may not be that comfortable with, and I start to feel uncomfortable. Instead of avoiding, which would be a normal reaction, I have a different relationship with discomfort and say, it's okay. If I'm uncomfortable, that means I'm going in the right direction. And that's the only way I know how to grow and transcend my norms, essentially. Is like, how do I get out of my safety zone? How do I get out of my comfort zone? So I would implore whoever's listening and interested in this topic to get yourself uncomfortable.
Thank you for that. I think that's a good point that we can move forward and kind of seek discomfort in that way. So I just want to formally just thank you, Dr. Singh, Toni, Jeremy, and Professor Weiner for being with us today. I know that I learned a lot, and I hope that our attendees did as well. And I think you've given me new insights to how I can approach dispute resolution and in the grander narrative as well, of relating to our national state and polarization, and relating from that to our workplace disputes and our interpersonal disputes and even inter disputes, intra disputes. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to let you know to all of our attendees as well that we host these panels on a monthly basis. So we'll have one in December. So keep an eye out each month for more discussions like this on topics related to peace building and conflict resolution. So again, thank you all so much for being here. I very much appreciate it, and I've loved the discussion.
Thanks all.
Thank you all.
Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.